I'm very much aware that this colloquium has attracted some extraordinary speakers, and so I'll do my level best to maintain the high standards that they've established. But I do want to thank the Mroz Institute for inviting me, to Professor Max Kovalov for his kindness in organizing a fabulous program for me today and tomorrow here on this beautiful campus. I had the opportunity this afternoon to attend 2 classes and to interact with some of your extraordinary students. It was plain to me from the questions, from their comments, that you really do have an exceptional body of students here. Their awareness of and commitment to global affairs, to involving themselves in international issues, is truly impressive. And I must say, very encouraging for someone at my age and stage looking to your generation to help solve the awful problems that we've created. We're very grateful to you and wish you the best of success. This evening, I'd like to address a topic that is more than just a policy issue or a political problem. It is truly a compelling claim upon our conscience. It is something that will directly affect our collective future, and that is the issue of forced displacement. And by forced displacement, I mean to refer to those who are driven from their chosen homes, either within their country or driven to cross a border to another country. As you know, if they're displaced within their own country, they are internally displaced persons. If they cross a border, they become refugees. And in addressing the subject, I propose to draw upon the work and the report of the World Refugee and Migration Council. Let me tell you a little bit about that council. It was created in 2017. It was funded in large part by the government of Canada, but also attracted financial support from foundations and think tanks in Canada, the United States, and elsewhere. Its chair is my former cabinet colleague, former Canadian Foreign Minister Lloyd Axworthy. And the council is composed of 25 extraordinary people from the 5 continents in the world, former leaders of government, former senior ministers, ambassadors, but also senior members of civil society and NGOs, academics with experience in the area of displacement. We had a Nobel Peace Prize laureate on the council, as well as a young woman who's the African Union's envoy for youth on that continent. So it was a disparate and an exceptional group that focused on the issues of the global response to displacement. The report was produced in the early months of 2019. And since then, we've been working, I say we, the council, myself, the chair, on persuading governments everywhere to adopt and implement our key recommendations. I'll describe the main recommendations tonight. I'll tell you what we're doing to try to get them acted upon. I'll solicit your help in that effort, your support for these principles, your advocacy for them, and I'll be happy to respond to any questions you might have. I think, first of all, I should talk a little bit about the current state of affairs with forced displacement. How many people are there in the world who are forcibly displaced? Who are they? Where are they? And what is the international community doing to respond to their needs, to ensure that they receive the support that they require? I resort to the records of the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, for some statistics. And I can tell you that as of last week, when I consulted the website most recently, 82.4 million people in this world are forcibly displaced. 26 million are refugees. And the balance, over 50 million people are internally displaced. 86% of the forcibly displaced are in developing countries. Significantly, 3/4 of the forcibly displaced are in countries that are neighbors to their own. So they didn't go very far. 3/4 are in a neighboring country. The vast majority of refugees came from 5 countries. You could probably name them. Syria. As you know, in 2011, the civil war started in Syria, which was met with the most brutal response by the Syrian government, which attacked its own population repeatedly, attempting to murder those who opposed it politically, using bombs, using chemical weapons. Syria has exported much of its population, which has had the effect of destabilizing much of the Middle East and indeed Europe, as we know from the experience in Germany commencing in 2015. The second exporting country for refugees is Myanmar. As you know, the Rohingya have always been victimized in Myanmar, but that ages-old persecution took a violent turn in 2017 when the military junta targeted the Rohingya, burned their villages, engaged in widespread sexual violence and murder, and drove 800,000 Rohingya out of the country into neighboring Bangladesh. Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro and his mad regime destroying the economy, depriving people of basic needs. 1/3 of the population of Venezuela has left, fleeing for their lives, many to Colombia, some to Peru, Chile, and beyond. South Sudan, which we thought was such a success story in 2008, 2009, with the signing of the North-South Peace Agreement, which ended decades of conflict in Sudan, the creation of a new country. I was in Juba in 2012. It was such a joyous occasion as the new state came into existence, but within a year, factions struggling for control, each of them corrupt, started a war which has victimized that population, driven millions out. And Afghanistan, need I say more? So those are the 5 countries that have produced the largest number of refugees, 7 out of 10. Of the forcibly displaced, more than half are women and girls. So gender issues, exploitation, abuse, gender-based violence, those are major issues when it comes to forced displacement, when it comes to responding to the needs of those who are driven from their homes, both internally and as refugees. And displacement in this context is not a temporary phenomenon. The record shows that when you're displaced, either internally or as a refugee, this is a long-term situation. Some of them for decades are living in camps, or living in cities as essentially stateless individuals. In fact, when we talk about refugees, we think about refugee camps. But most refugees don't live there. They live in cities, which is a mixed blessing. One thinks of being in the urban environment as more liberating or more relaxed or pleasant, but the refugee in the urban context is often at a grave disadvantage. It's more difficult to get needed services to them. And most of the time, they're not allowed to work in the local economy, so they can't support themselves. So either way, it is for the most part a miserable and difficult existence. What is the global framework for responding to the needs of the forcibly displaced? Well, the UNHCR was created to address the issue as a collective response under the 1951 Refugee Convention, entered into in the wake of the Second World War, when millions were displaced in Europe. In essence, the convention codified the ages-old principle of asylum. It has always been the case since ancient days that when a citizen of another state appeared at your border seeking refuge from persecution or violence, you granted asylum. That's the human and humane tradition of time immemorial. So the convention codified that. Significantly, though, the 1951 Refugee Convention is the only United Nations convention without an independent supervisory authority. So there's no one at arm's length to provide oversight, to monitor compliance. And the convention itself speaks only of international cooperation. It doesn't talk about responsibility, just cooperation among member states. The UNHCR has a mandate which makes it responsible for the needs of refugees, but not for internally displaced persons. So you've got 26 million refugees, which are their responsibility, but the 52 million internally displaced are not. As a matter of practice, the UNHCR informally takes that role on and does the best it can, but it's not systematic. And as I'll explain, it's not properly funded, and it's not always present to provide what's needed. This, of course, is because of the political issues that arise with internal displacement. It's one thing for the nations of the world to say, we'll set up a regime for those who have to cross a border and go around the world. It's quite another thing for member states to agree that there'll be somebody looking at how states treat their own population within their own borders. That they're not prepared to do. So the internally displaced are orphans of this system, even though they're vastly more numerous than refugees. And how is UNHCR funded? I can only say on a haphazard basis. The funding of UNHCR is voluntary. It's like a charity fair. You can give if you want, but you needn't. The main contributors every year are between 10 and 20 leading economies. And with UNHCR reliant on their dollars, it's little wonder that UNHCR doesn't much voice criticism of the leading nations of the world for failing to meet their collective responsibility. UNHCR is always underfunded. As we traveled the world to places where refugees are found, when we saw UNHCR in those places, they would tell us about the difficulty they had in meeting their budget. In fact, on average, we found that UNHCR was funded to about 38% of the amount it requested in its budget for every one of these refugee situations. And as between them, if refugees get too little funding, IDPs get a fraction of that. It's estimated that 15% of the money devoted for refugees is allocated for the assistance of internally displaced persons. So those are the numbers. And if I may say so, those numbers are going to get significantly bigger. The situation considerably worse as the effects of climate change and global warming are felt. Droughts, floods, fires, extreme heat. You've seen it for yourselves, how people lose their homes. And of course, I needn't tell you about the peril of the rising seas. This week alone, you saw tides in Charleston at over 8 feet, an unprecedented phenomenon. But it's something, I'm sad to say, we have to get used to. Indeed, new technologies and current data allow the measurement of slow onset climate change like rising sea levels. And it's thought at present that those rising levels will put more people at risk than we had imagined. It's estimated that 93 million people in China, 42 million in Bangladesh, 36 million in India will face displacement as their very lands are flooded and the sea rises. Survival in those circumstances will very much depend on a state's ability to adapt. In Indonesia, Indonesia is spending $33 billion to relocate its capital city from Jakarta to Borneo on higher land because the current capital isn't going to exist within 50 years. Now, that's something that Indonesia is able to do, but if you look at the small island developing states, the little island states in the Pacific or the Caribbean, incidentally, they produce less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but they're going to pay the steepest price because they're going to disappear by 2050. And what do we do when 449,000 Maldivians turn up on our doorstep saying, our country's gone? We can hardly send them home. So we have to develop answers to these questions. The numbers are going to rise, and the needs are going to become more pressing, and the responses are going to have to be there. Given the scale of the issue now and as projected, issues are raised with respect to international peace and security. So even if we're not motivated by altruism in addressing these issues, we should at least be driven to act out of our own self-interest to preserve a stable international order, because nothing is more destabilizing than mass migration brought about by forced displacement. I want to develop the principal recommendations that the Council makes to deal with all of this. Before I do that, I make one other point. The recommendations that we made are to governments, and it's a political report, and we want those governments to adopt and implement these recommendations. So, and it's essential, therefore, that those governments maintain the trust and confidence of their own populations. So the starting point of our report is that each state must have the authority to control its own borders. It makes neither sense nor for security to allow unrestricted movement across borders. We do not propose that. We understand the states have to control their borders. It's sensible, and that's the way it should be. But what we insist is that that can be done in a global order in a manner that's effective and humane, with appropriate respect for the lives and well-being of those who seek asylum. So what do we recommend? The first and most fundamental recommendation is that UN member states embrace the principle of responsibility sharing. But this is a collective responsibility in which each of us has something to do. This is common but differentiated responsibility, as that term is used in the climate change setting. Each of us is part of the solution, but it's not one size fits all. Each of us may have a different contribution to make and help in one way or another. But the point is, we're all in this, and we're all to do our part. Responsibility sharing is no part of the 1951 Refugee Convention. The cooperation among states that it spoke of may have meant something in 1951. Doesn't mean an awful lot in 2021. Today, as you've heard, the principal responsibility to accommodate the forcibly displaced has fallen upon those states that neighbor the country involved. So Uganda has received almost 1.5 million refugees from South Sudan. I was in northern Uganda in 2017 and visited the settlements near the border. And I saw the extraordinary number of South Sudanese who flooded into that country, mostly in northern settlements, but some of them have also come south to the cities. For the refugees in Syria, apart from those who went to Europe, this means Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. I was in the Zakari refugee camp in Jordan near the border of Syria with 85,000 Syrian refugees doing the best they can to survive. For Venezuela, as I mentioned, it means Colombia, it means Chile, it means Peru. We were in Colombia, in Bogota in 2020, met with the incoming president and vice president, minister of foreign affairs. They described the extent to which this was placing a burden on the budget of Colombia to provide education, access to social services, and otherwise. In Myanmar, of course, it has meant that Bangladesh has received 800,000, which are now in the appalling conditions of the refugee encampment there. Those host countries were already struggling as countries in the process of development. Responsibility should not be determined by geographic proximity, not when we're talking about a need that relates to our shared humanity. World Refugee and Migration Council proposes a protocol to the 1951 Convention, which will add the notion of responsibility and sharing. And we call on interested countries to create a task force to define all elements of responsibility sharing. What kind of contribution will count? What is differentiated responsibility in this context? And we propose that, like in the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, there be peer review to examine the performance of member states to determine whether countries are falling behind in meeting their collective responsibility. And if there are, then they should be named and identified as countries not doing their part. So the first recommendation is the fundamental notion that we're all in this together, and we all ought to contribute to the solution. The second recommendation is that the notion of accountability ought to be introduced into this context. It does not exist at present. So I speak of accountability here in two senses. First of all, upstream, if I can put it that way, the causes of forced displacement. And second, downstream, after it's occurred, accountability for the way you respond to it. In terms of the causes, we know that bad governance is a major cause. And we know also that the leaders of the regimes responsible for bad governance, producing displacement, for the most part enjoy impunity. Al-Assad in Syria, has he been held to account? What about those responsible for bombing children in Yemen and creating displacement there? What about the two galoots in South Sudan whose greed and avarice has caused years of violence and displacement, never held to account? Maduro in Venezuela, scot-free. They must be held to account, if not in their own domestic courts, then in an international tribunal. And preventing this kind of abuse should be a priority for the international community. The notion of responsibility to protect comes in here, because that very notion, those very principles were designed to prevent this kind of abuse, mass atrocity leading to displacement. And of course, accountability also includes accountability for corruption, which is so closely tied in to the bad governance to which I referred. And here the World Refugee Migration Council aligns itself with those who call for the creation of an international anti-corruption court, which would be a court of complementary jurisdiction and have jurisdiction to criminally charge those responsible for corruption and any co-conspirators who enabled or facilitated it. On paper, the primary role for dealing with prevention, for ending impunity, for calling for accountability should be the Security Council of the United Nations. But that council is dysfunctional. The 5 permanent members, with their right of veto, stand in the way of any meaningful response. Notwithstanding the genocide in Myanmar in front of our very eyes, China blocks any effort at the table to respond. Notwithstanding the crimes against humanity and war crimes by Assad in Syria, Russia, which carries out some of those attacks, stands in the way at the Security Council table. And in Yemen, most of them are silent because in the proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, they've got some interest of their own at stake. By the way, I'll just open a bracket here briefly to mention there's recent scholarship that causes hope that we can confront that outrage of the veto at the table. Professor Jennifer Trahan of New York University has published a book which makes a compelling case in detail for the proposition that the exercise by the P5 of a veto in cases of alleged mass atrocities is illegal. And she bases that argument on 3 grounds. She says, first of all, in the hierarchy of international law, the most important and fundamental law, the jus cogens, is that which prohibits the kind of crime we're talking about. And it's a law that's superior in its force and effect to the legal basis for the veto, trumps it. And therefore, exercising the veto in those circumstances is contrary to fundamental law. Second, she says exercising the veto is contrary to the Charter of the United Nations, which, yes, gives the P5 a veto, but which also calls upon members of the Security Council to exercise their authority in keeping with the purposes and principles of the United Nations. Those purposes and principles require member states to prevent genocide, to encourage peaceful resolution of disputes, and is anything but a basis for vetoing a response to mass atrocity. And the third reason, she says, is the P5 members are themselves bound to certain conventions that they themselves adopted and ratified, including the Genocide Convention. And so vetoing a step at the table intended to respond to a mass atrocity is in some cases a blatant disregard of their own treaty obligation to prevent genocide. Professor Trahan has called upon the General Assembly to refer these questions to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion, and many of us are calling upon Canada to lead that effort in the General Assembly. So that has to do with accountability up front to the thugs and the hoodlums and the brigands who are causing these issues through their own corrupt and bad governance. And what about downstream accountability? Well, we say that member states of the UN should be accountable for the way they respond to this collective responsibility to deal with forced displacement. Member states have common but differentiated responsibility. For some, that will mean contributing money. Perhaps they can't accept a large number of refugees. Fair enough. But where's your checkbook? For those states who don't contribute or who pledge and don't deliver, there should be accountability. Member states who turn away asylum seekers at their borders in disregard of their obligation to the Refugee Convention should be held to account. those who subject asylum seekers to inhumane treatment. And once again, we call upon independent peer review to evaluate the response of member states so it can be judged against the standard of reasonableness. So our second major recommendation is let's put some accountability in this system. So member states can't just behave the way they want, depending on the flavor of the most recent administration. Third major recommendation is for new sources of funding. We call upon the Secretary General to lead the effort to change the funding model for UNHCR so that it's compulsory assessment for all member states, determined based on the size of their economy, as they do for other purposes at the United Nations. Do you know that in 2019, UNHCR requested a budget of $8.6 billion for its global enterprise? It received only $4 billion. And that's to deal with the numbers that I spoke of earlier. It's an absurd situation, and it has to change. We propose compulsory assessment. We also suggest innovative means of financing, like governments issuing refugee bonds as they issue green bonds in the climate context. We call upon the business community to develop private equity vehicles. We recommend that we convene a forum of banks and fund managers to look at possibilities. I can tell you that in Colombia, after our trip there, we came back and we put together some private investors with the government of Colombia to co-fund housing projects, which are intended to meet the needs of refugees in Colombia. A combination of private sector initiative and government funding to produce results on the ground. We call as well on the business sector to create a global coalition with refugees. The Tent Foundation out of New York has done this, putting together business interests and refugees, not only to have businesses hire refugees, but also to use them in their supply chains for the manufacturing and delivering of the goods that are produced. Our fourth recommendation is that given the preponderance of refugees in host countries that are neighboring the state which had the displacement, the international community should respond immediately by assisting those host countries, the Ugandas, the Colombians, the Jordans. They're struggling. In many of those countries, the refugees, as I mentioned, are not allowed to work. When we were in Jordan, we learned of an innovative mechanism by which Jordan negotiated with the European Union for a preferential tariff on its exported goods, so long as those goods were manufactured with contribution from refugees. And Jordan, in response, issued 100,000 work permits for refugees. Prior to that, they were not allowed to work at all. And now Jordan has issued 100,000 work permits as a start to produce goods that will get into Europe at a preferential rate. Now that's good for the Jordanian economy, it's good for Europe, and it's good for refugees. And we think that model should be replicated elsewhere. We have to be careful with gender equity because most of the jobs went to men. But once we deal with gender equity and fine tune the proposal, we believe it's a winning formula elsewhere. We have an opinion from a trade lawyer in Canada with respect to the WTO documents contending that it's lawful under the WTO rules and regulations to put that in place. We call also for flexible debt management for the host countries that have a significant number of refugees. The World Bank has concessional financing. The International Monetary Fund does not. We need more flexibility for these countries in managing their debt and longer term loans on highly concessionary terms. That's something the international community can do to recognize the outsized contribution being made by the host countries. We call upon the World Bank funding to be reallocated so that if some was intended to go to Maduro, it be reapportioned to go to Colombia instead, where the need is, so we don't reward Maduro's bad government, but we try to deal with it in a practical way. Lastly, let me touch upon internally displaced persons. I mentioned these are the orphans of the global system. And there's no easy answer because we're dealing with highly sensitive political issues with the government in which the persons are displaced. But we do call for the appointment of a special representative of the Secretary General of the UN, responsible only for the plight of the internally displaced. That they be put on the agenda once and for all, that a global forum be established to talk about them, talk about who they are, where they are, how their needs are being met or not, and work with countries with a large number of internally displaced to find solutions to the grave injustice that they're suffering. So this is all very well, it's optimistic and forward-looking and it's progressive. It's also, some might think, complete pie in the sky. I mean, in this crazy world, who thinks any of this is really going to happen? Well, I do, for one. I think it's something that can be done. And what we're proposing is a global action network to get it done. We're talking about a network of support of governments, civil society, and refugee groups themselves, academics, students, and that network work with governments everywhere to bring them around to this way of thinking, to have them accept a share of responsibility, to look at some of the reforms we're proposing and to support them. It was Pope Francis who said, diplomacy is the work of small steps. Okay, well, let's start taking some small steps toward these big goals. Let's not be discouraged. Let's start at the beginning and follow it through, remembering the importance and urgency of the task. You know, there's something called the Canadian model we'd like to work from. Canadian model refers, for example, to the 1997 Treaty on Landmines. Anti-personnel landmines had been denounced internationally for decades, and there was a process within the United Nations to do something about it. And every 6 months, the committee would meet and they'd bicker and they'd adjourn for another 6 months. And Canada watched this discouraging performance and decided that we'd take a different approach. Canada convened all of the NGOs, all of the hyperactive, deeply committed activists who wanted to see these things banned. And we brought Norway, and we brought Sweden and the Netherlands, the usual suspects, right? We brought all of these like-minded governments to the table with the energy of civil society, and then we allocated to the various NGOs responsibility for their own sectors to put the arm on their governments to bring them around to supporting a treaty. And then our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Axworthy at the time, announced that a year hence, there'd be a meeting in Ottawa to sign the treaty. People were shocked, saying, there isn't a treaty. What is this man thinking? He's dreaming in Technicolor. Well, a year later, 41 countries came to Ottawa and signed that treaty. And within a year, we had enough ratifying it to make it law. And today there are 142 countries who've ratified the Landmines Treaty. That's the Canadian model. You go around the obstruction. You harness the energy of the committed and the activism of civil society to persuade governments to get behind a worthy idea. Much the same was done with R2P, proposed in 2001 by an international commission. By the time R2P was proposed, 9/11 had happened. And the topic had turned from humanitarian intervention over to security. That's what was on people's minds. And then the invasion of Iraq was discussed, which, as you know, was extremely controversial. When I was at the UN in 2003 and 2004, it was the only thing talked about. And the concern was powerful states from the north invading countries of the global south on a whim, grave mistrust about Western governments as a result. And there was Canada proposing responsibility to protect, principle that would have empowered the Security Council to authorize a military intervention to stop a mass atrocity. It wasn't exactly the most popular notion in New York City at the time. But by 2005, we were able to differentiate R2P from Iraq, rebut Tony Blair, who claimed R2P justified the invasion of Iraq, and persuade member states that the principle was worth supporting. The International Criminal Court in 1998, the Rome Statute, Canada played an important role in bringing that into existence. The first president of the court was a Canadian, but we assisted in the drafting of the treaty and once again worked with those who are deeply committed to the cause to bring others on board. And we say we can do exactly the same here if we can put together the essential elements that I described tonight. If we can draft a protocol to the 1951 convention, if we can get like-minded governments, a dozen, 20, 25, to adopt the principles I spoke of more regularized funding, of accountability, of responsibility sharing, of dealing more fairly with the internally displaced, we can develop a momentum which over time can have a real impact on the way we respond to these issues. Let me close with an observation. I mentioned that in the course of our work, we went to a variety of places around the world where refugees are found. And something struck me about what we found. I mentioned Uganda and Colombia in particular. In northern Uganda, 1.5 million refugees from South Sudan. And when they arrived, the government of Uganda gave them a plot of land, 30 meters square, gave them crops to plant, equipment to use in farming, gave them free access to all social services as though they were citizens, freedom of travel, they could move to Kampala if they wanted. And I said to the fellow who was the representative of the prime minister, I said, you know, this is not what we're finding all over the world. What is it that lies behind the attitude of Ugandans to the South Sudanese coming across the border? He said, well, you know, we figure it's our turn. When we had a madman running our government, many of us fled to Sudan. We were received there. They put up with us. They helped us out for a few years. We got rid of the madman and we came back. Now it's our turn. In Colombia, millions of Venezuelans. I told you about the strain it's putting on the Colombian budget, but the attitude there expressed by Colombians themselves is that, well, wait a second. When we had our awful war with the FARC and the drug cartels, and we were plagued by violence and insecurity, many of us fled to Venezuela. And they received us, and we survived. And when our crisis ended, we came back. Well, you know what? Now it's our turn. So that is empathy. That is reciprocity. That is recognition of common humanity, common experience, and a preparedness to do for others what they did for you. And you know, Martin Luther King said, we may have come on different ships, but we're all in the same boat now. And we are. We're in the same boat now. So in all of this, we'll need your voice. We'll need your support. We'll need the help you can provide as academics, as academic leaders, as students, as citizens. We have in this world at present an absence of empathy, and has caused a coarsening of language as we close our doors and build our walls. And that must change. The report of which I speak tonight encourages us to acknowledge our common humanity, a sharing of responsibility, addressing the root causes of this forced displacement, a generosity of spirit, and a world without walls. So I end as I began by saying that it's a big task, it's an urgent task, but the longer we leave it, the more it's going to threaten our own security. So I urge you to help, and I thank you again for your attention. Thanks. I can't imagine that there are any questions arising from that, but
closer to the microphone.
have you had to watch television all this time? How distracting for you.
Hey, I have a question for you. So in your great presentation, by the way, very eloquent and moving. We're really honored to have you here tonight with us. In your presentation, you mentioned there's about 84, 85 million people displaced around the world right now. And you listed the 5 main countries. It seems like for the most part, the vast majority of the displaced folks are due to political unrest. But and a lot of your recommendations seem to be based upon mitigating those bad actor countries. At the same time, in your presentation, you mentioned that climate change will contribute to 80 million in China, I can't remember, 60 million, it added up to more than 85 million who will be displaced due to climate change. So do you have any recommendations for how we can factor that into the long-term refugees around the world?
Well, I guess my point is, first of all, we know that in Glasgow and elsewhere, there is an effort internationally to address climate change by mitigating its effect, trying to keep the impact of climate change within the 1.5 degree limit or thereabouts. So one part of the answer is to try everything we can collectively to mitigate those consequences over time. We're talking about 2050 here. If we can do the best we can to keep those numbers as small as possible, the fewest possible number of people are displaced. That's one answer. The other answer is, if we follow the recommendations here and create a global regime where every member state of the UN recognizes it has a part to play in responding to displacement, where you're accountable if you don't do your share, where the effort to accommodate the displaced is properly funded, and where we deal with IDPs in a humane and effective way, then you're preparing yourself for those scenarios when the 30 million in India, the 90 million in China, and the others their lands are flooded and they have to move. Obviously, in countries like China, you'd expect the Chinese government will find solutions as well, but it'll need international support in doing that and sharing of research and whatever it may take. So I guess I'm just contending that we ought to have a mindset that looks at this issue as something we have to tackle together. And as it worsens over time with climate change, there's still displacement, whether it's caused by violence or not. There are going to be refugees, climate refugees, and we should be able to respond to their needs effectively. And I think these recommendations are as applicable to them as they are to the victims of an Assad in Syria. Is that responsive to your question?
I would like to invite some students if you have any questions.
Do you believe the International Court of Justice will take the framework presented for the veto restraints? How do you think they will respond to that?
Well, the International Court of Justice would have jurisdiction to receive a reference from the General Assembly. It would be an advisory opinion because it isn't adjudicating a list between two parties. And so it wouldn't be binding. But the wonderful thing about such an advisory opinion, if it was ever favorable to Jennifer's thesis, it would be a strong political weapon in the hands of those of us who contend the Security Council ought not to stand in the way of responding to mass atrocity, to make it very politically difficult for Russia and China to turn down the next Myanmar resolution, assuming that there's another genocide. So I think there's great value in an advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice. I mean, I've read the book, I've discussed it with her, I've been on panels debating it. I'm convinced that the legal arguments are sound and very compelling. I don't know what, I can't guarantee what the result will be, but I can tell you it's a very serious question you'd be putting in before the ICJ. And I'd be hopeful that they'd be able to issue an advisory opinion saying it is unlawful for a P5 member to veto a resolution aimed at stopping a mass atrocity. That would be quite an achievement in this world.
My mail every day has 11 out of 12 letters want money. If I were going to give some money to help refugees, what would you suggest?
I missed the first part of your question.
I said my mail every day has 12 letters wanting money.
Oh,
Yeah, so if I were going to help the refugees, what would you recommend?
well, there's so many, I mean, financially, the UNHCR is always looking for money. They've certainly taken it from me. But there's a Norwegian Refugee Council. There are many NGOs who work directly in the field assisting refugees who are, in my respectful view, very worthy of our support. But the United States government is also a major contributor through USAID and otherwise. So politically supporting that and encouraging the government to continue that's important. Speaking of the United States, I didn't mention it, and I meant to. In the context of responsibility sharing, the Council has created a task force on the issues at the southern US border with Central and South America. This task force is co-chaired by a number of people associated with the Council, but also former ministers and senior officials from governments in Central and South America themselves, along with the Conference of Catholic Bishops and other influential groups. We're trying to find ways to translate these principles into action here in the Americas, looking at the pressures on the southern US border as a regional issue for which Canada has a share of responsibility as well. We can't just say to America, you go solve this problem. We're in this too. And if we want to be true to our principles about responsibility sharing, we got to roll up our sleeves and work with America, work with Mexico, work with Central American governments to find solutions. And we've produced 3 reports so far with specific concrete recommendations. One of the co-chairs of the Council is Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State. And through Secretary Albright's good offices, we're trying to put these recommendations in front of your Vice President, who's been asked by the President to look at the issues on the border. We believe that we can bring to life some of the principles I spoke of earlier in the context of Central and South America. And that doesn't really answer your question, but you made me think of it, so I mentioned it. Well, I think UNHCR is always a good investment there. The money's going to the right purpose. It's not being eaten up by administration. They're very responsible with their contributions. But if you'd like me to, I can send you a list of some of the people we deal with who are active in the field, like the Norwegian Refugee Council, and for you to have a look at and go to their websites and check them out.
Thank you so much for being here tonight too. I'm right over here. right in front of you. Kind of going off of that question, could you speak a little bit on the differences between an internationally operating organization coming into a crisis versus kind of grassroots organizations acting and how they work together, maybe poorly or well in those contexts?
It's often a challenge, and I'm speaking not just in the refugee context, but from the work I've done in Africa, in Uganda, Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, and in Sri Lanka. The relationship between large multinational organizations, especially UN funds and agencies, and local or more regional NGOs, is often fraught. For that reason, when there's a United Nations presence in a country, as in the case of Burundi or DRC, there's often a country team that's put together, which has the UN representatives, UNICEF, UNHCR, food program, as the case may be. But at the table, they also include the local NGOs and the private interests, and they try to coordinate efforts, preserve a good state of relationship, and make it a more productive undertaking. So there are efforts by the UN team leader, usually a special representative of the Secretary General, to bring everybody to one table, to open up constructive conversations and smooth out issues that arise among them. But there almost always are, because after all, they're human beings, right? There are going to be rivalries, resentments, some degree of chafing. I think what the SRSG tries to do is to remind people of the greater good, but we're here for the population, not for your turf war, so work together. But it's often a challenge.
Hi, Ambassador Rock. Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us. This has been a really informative talk. So I'm wondering what we as students can do to advocate for refugees on such a large scale, because a lot of this is policy, and as students, obviously we're not the ones making the policy choices. We can have a voice in making them, but what tangible impacts can we make? Well, I think the first thing to do is to, as you're doing, inform yourself about it, become sensitive to the issues, some of the solutions. Maybe you agree with what I said, maybe you don't, maybe you have other ideas. But I think preparing yourself to participate fully in the public debate is really important. And then I think, you have an enormously important voice. I was speaking in one of the classes today, and because of my advanced age, I was able to draw upon memories which are still sort of in there somewhere about the time when I was in your position in the 1960s, when the world was going through another very difficult time. America in particular, very divisive, lots of protest, widespread discontent with the policies of government. It was a turbulent time. Young people led us in all that. They led the protests. They demanded the government change policies. And government did. They brought about real change. So never underestimate the power of your voice when you're heard on these issues in demanding that governments change their policies. I'm very reluctant to come to another country and be critical of it. So I'm going to be very careful in what I say. I don't want to be ungracious. But there are things happening in America that you could speak out against. And you're not allowed under the 1951 Refugee Convention, when someone comes to your border seeking asylum, claiming that they're being persecuted in their native state, you're not allowed just to send them back to their native state. That's called refoulement, and it's prohibited by the 1951 convention. It's contrary to international law. That's going on in America. And Canada shares some of the responsibility too. We have a safe third agreement with the United States, meaning that if a refugee comes to the United States and is admitted and granted asylum, if that refugee then comes to Canada, we can turn them away saying, no, you're already in a safe third country. Don't come to Canada. We signed that agreement with America in the early part of the 2000s. Well, maybe that's not right either. I mean, things have changed in America, and maybe we should reevaluate
the Canadian policy in that regard. I've certainly said publicly that we should. So I think identifying issues like that, where you feel that your government or a UN agency is doing something which ought to be corrected, having your voice being heard, that can have a major impact. You shouldn't underestimate it.
Thank you.
Uh, The problem of internally displaced persons is complicated by the fact in a lot of the countries where this occurs, the country's not interested in having anything done about them. So what sorts of solutions do you have to the problem of IDPs, especially in countries where they tell you, well, you're meddling with our internal politics?
Yeah, they do. They do. They say that's our affair, not yours. Well, that's why I think the appointment of an SRSG who would have the authority to evaluate the circumstances in which IDPs are being housed or supported in various countries. The convening of a global forum to talk about the issue, have those countries come to the table and say, we don't want you to come near our country. That's our affair, not yours. Have them come and say that publicly. Let's put a spotlight on it. Let's have a public discussion about it. Let's say publicly how many IDPs there are in that country. Let's talk about their state of health, their food insecurity, and the state of their housing and access to social services. I think there are ways to put pressure on governments that can be very effective. And we should use those. You know, a couple of times in the course of my remarks, I talked about peer review, identifying countries falling short. Again, we shouldn't underestimate the impact of that. I have experience with that in the context of child soldiers. When I was at the UN, we supported resolutions adopted by the Security Council on the subject of children in armed conflict that required the Secretary General to file an annual report on the question of children being killed or maimed in armed conflict or being recruited to be used as child soldiers. And the resolution also called for a list to be published every year, identifying the states or non-state actors responsible for those crimes against children. It's called the List of Shame. It was first published in about 2005. Countries don't like being on the list of shame. In fact, Saudi Arabia in 2012, 13, it was during the tenure of Ban Ki-moon, heard that it was going to be on the list because it's killing kids in Yemen, bombing them. And it said to Ban Ki-moon, if you don't get our name off that list, we're going to withdraw any Saudi funding for any UN agency, period. And Ban Ki-moon did. He buckled. But the point is, that's how important it was to Saudi Arabia not to be labeled on the list of shame. That's the kind of leverage we can use to our advantage in calling countries to account for the conduct that I've described in this context. It's the same principle. So IDPs, of course they're going to say that. They're going to say that's our affair. As Rwanda said, don't come near us during our genocide. It's our affair if we murder half the population. At a certain point, those assertions are absurd and can't go unchallenged. And that's why responsibility to protect was adopted. And that's why we can deal with these countries who are leaving their internally displaced in circumstances that are inhumane or intolerable. Well, we have another question.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you for speaking. I really enjoyed it. I just had a question about, so you touched on accountability, and let's say that we do adopt these key recommendations from you and the council. How will we keep them in place with the changing presidencies and like shifting policies and problems?
With the change of presidencies in countries, you mean?
Yes.
Well, the accountability that I spoke of starts with the UN Security Council. The Security Council has been corrupted and it's no longer fit for purpose. It's dysfunctional. It's not doing its job. It's not focusing on international peace and security, its maintenance and restoration. It's focusing on the national interests of the 5 permanent members. Its deliberations and its proceedings are dominated by rivalries among them. And they're not focused on the needs of the people. They're focused on their own priorities. So, I mean, accountability starts there. The Security Council was created in order to provide for accountability. When international peace and security is threatened, Chapter 7 of the UN Charter gives the Security Council ample authority to impose everything from political denunciation to sanctions, no-fly zones, right through the military intervention if appropriate. And so, despite the coming of or going of presidents and regimes, fact is, if the Security Council functions as it should, there will be constancy on accountability. Furthermore, we also recommend that nations recognize common but differentiated responsibility for forced displacement, and that their performance be reviewed by peer nations on an independent basis, and the results of that review be made public. Now, I guess you might say if a different American president or German chancellor or UK prime minister is elected, that person might denounce such a regime, possibly. But, you know, let's get it in place and let's support it. And if the countries that lead the charge here are prepared to defend it, we can make it survive such a challenge. So I guess what I'm arguing for is the adoption of fundamental principles, and that we defend those principles regardless of who's in the White House or who's in 10 Downing Street, and try to make sure that their universal nature is respected ongoing despite political changes.
I had a question. During your entire presentation, I was thinking about this, and you mentioned it right at the end, the lack of empathy in the current moment that we perceive. And I guess it's following up to your question, which was wonderful. I guess I wanted to ask what recommendations your organization would have for pushing back on sort of this trend we're seeing in different wealthy countries, at least, of far-right populism, nativism, xenophobia that often leads countries to accepting less refugees. And thank you for being so kind as to not criticize the country you're in, but it was glaring omissions of things you could have criticized here to that extent, also in terms of the number of refugees that we could be taking in compared to other countries per capita, like Germany, for example, here in the US. So I guess my question is, does the Canadian solution of going around these populist movements work, or do we need to address them head on? How do we go about doing that and bringing back empathy and sort of faith in these ideals?
I think they're two different things. The Canadian solution is a procedural method to overcome institutional obstacles by harnessing energy outside the UN system, producing a result, and then bringing it into the UN system afterwards. So that's process. I think it's very valuable, but it doesn't speak to the point you're raising, which is broader and more fundamental, namely, how do we move the needle on public attitudes? And that, of course, I have already answered. That's a simple question anybody could answer. I'm happy to provide the answer. I have no idea. But, you know, this came up a couple of times today in class. Professor Malik was talking about some of this and how we deal with it. And a couple of thoughts. First of all, in Germany, we went to Berlin and we met with government, business, NGOs and civil society, refugees. And we talked to them about what was described as the toxic narrative, that the refugees flooding into Germany are going to wreck the country, undermine our culture, take our jobs, foment violence, a toxic culture that led to mistrust and fear, negativity. And what we found is that there were a number of people, a large number of people, working very hard to displace that toxic narrative. One example I gave was this NGO that I always thought was so wonderful. They bought a dozen steel shipping containers, the Maersk containers you see on the back of trucks, and they converted them into fold-out kitchens, and they took them to communities around Germany, and they convened tables on Sunday evening where refugees would make dinner together with the local German population, and they'd talk over dinner and they'd exchange recipes, and something as simple and human as having a meal together broke down barriers, changed attitudes, and little by little, things like that, little ripples that can grow into a tide that changes public opinion. So, I mean, it's complicated, but a recent poll in Canada demonstrated that a clear majority of Canadians have a very positive attitude toward immigration and refugees. We see them as helping build a nation. We see them as enriching our society. We lived through the boat people in the 70s who left Vietnam. 200,000 came to Canada, and now they're in leading positions in the professions and in government. So we draw a direct line between the arrival and enriching our country, economically and otherwise. How do you get that out there? How do you broaden that? Well, I think political leadership is an important part of it. I think having a political leader that stands up and says, wait a minute, this is the right thing to do. There's something in this for us as well. Don't say that about the newly arrived person, and tackle some of those myths and prejudices and biases. It takes political courage, but I bet that person would find a constituency to support them if they spoke that way. A lot of people are uncomfortable with the way things are, but they're worried about speaking out. I think political leadership that said that, at the same time said, as I did tonight, we're going to control our borders, but by gosh, we also have to be humane in the way we deal with asylum seekers, and we can do both. So in many ways, it's a failure of imagination, and it's a failure of leadership. And I think courageous leadership is such an important part of the response to your question. And the other thing I might add is in Canada, we have something called private sponsorship or community sponsorship of refugees. It started in the 70s when the Vietnamese refugees came to Canada. What happens is, rather than refugees being a government responsibility, we sign up families or individuals in communities who are prepared to take on responsibility for the refugee. And when the refugee arrives, the group of families meets with them, makes sure they have housing, winter clothes for the kids, enrolled in school, English as second language courses, financial responsibility as well, making sure they're backstopped financially till they get their feet on the ground. The government provides some financial assistance, but the fundamental responsibility is in the community sponsorship. And it's a growing program. It accommodated thousands of refugees from Syria in 2015-16. It's accommodating thousands from Afghanistan. The American government is now looking at adopting it in America. And one of my colleague professors at the law school, Dr. Jennifer Bond, has been retained by the government of Canada to promote it in Europe. In Germany, they're very interested, in the UK, and she's working also with the American government. That's another way of tackling this empathy question, because when someone says to you, my God, those refugees are coming in here with their own religion, it's bizarre, and they're going to undermine our culture and take our jobs and ruin it. You say, wait a second. You're talking about the fellow I had dinner with on Sunday night. I got his kids snowsuits for the winter. I drove them to their first class. What are you talking about? Don't speak about them like that. They become a person as opposed to an abstraction. And I think that's a very powerful influence as well. So there are things we can do, and we mustn't think it's hopeless. Political leadership, community action, all of it's important.
Ambassador Rock, thank you for such a powerful and an inspiring message and conversation. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Max.
And I would like to thank everyone, our audience on Zoom, and so all of you who are present here in this auditorium. Thank you for joining us for this talk. This is the final talk of the semester. We have an exciting program that is coming in the spring semester, and I hope you will join us in next semester. Thank you.